Hello, and welcome to our webcast presentation, Seeing with Global Eyes. My name is DJ Netz, and I'm the current past president of the ATD Cascadia chapter. Through our generous partnership with Brand Live, we're going to hear best practices and perspectives for increasing our capacity for inclusion and diversity and inclusion in our organizations. Our presenter today is Dimitra Giannakoulias. She is the principal of Demisera Consulting, and as a consultant, facilitator, and trainer, she partners with her clients to create vibrant and healthy workplaces. She specializes in intercultural leadership and management, and she uses cross-cultural perspectives to enrich our understanding of human diversity in the workplace. Her aim is to help individuals and organizations transform the workplace to meet people's higher needs for learning, growth, balance, and community, as well as connection to the natural world. During this webcast, we're going to have a few opportunities for you to respond to questions through the chat window. So we encourage you to be ready and to participate and stay alert for the questions that Dimitra is going to ask. In a similar spirit, we welcome your questions. Whenever you have a question for Dimitra, please type your question into the chat window. I'm going to be right here to monitor all the incoming questions and present them to Dimitra, and she'll answer them in real time. So Dimitra, let's get started.
Great. Hello, and thank you for joining this talk on diversity and the intercultural lens. And thank you, DJ and the ATD board, for inviting me to return to ATD. It's a real honor to be here.
We're so happy that we could make this happen.
Great, thank you. As many of us can understand from our own experiences, the topic of diversity and inclusion is a difficult one. There are many reasons for that, but I hope that this conversation inspires us to reimagine how we undertake diversity, and I hope you find the whole topic as fascinating and full of amazing opportunity as I do. One key theme of our conversation is that diversity goes beyond demographic labels and backgrounds. It's also about different ways of being, about what we think makes a good leader, and what behaviors and skills, traits and abilities we think are valuable at work. When we diversify what we think is valuable, we'll be in a better position to offer equal opportunities to all. Another thing I want us to walk away with is this, that intercultural practices are to be integrated as part of a larger strategy. So in conjunction with concerted hiring and retention efforts and larger structural supports with intercultural practices, we can begin building a foundation for more enduring and lasting change. Great, so let's get started. Now, in this talk, we are going to be exploring 3 questions. The first question, what is diversity? Here we'll look at what I call deep diversity. And deep diversity is about recognizing our hidden differences in our approaches to life and work. What is interculturalism? Here we examine the principles that not only help people navigate cross-cultural settings, but also open us up to new ways of being that enrich our workplaces. And finally, how can we use intercultural practices in diversity initiatives? Here we touch on a few guidelines, but we don't get down to the nitty-gritty of designing an initiative. This issue is enormously complex, and there are many forces at play. And we look at one avenue of that complexity, which is organizational culture. So, diving into our discussion, what is diversity? In the United States, the word diversity has unique connotations. When we think of this word, we tend to think of race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, LGBTQ, and because of our long history of inequality in the United States, these are linked to equity issues. And we are, of course, still grappling with the legacy of our history. However, in addition to our own demographics and our struggles for equity, diversity is also about the human psyche, cognition, emotion, expression, temperament, and personality. And this is what I call deep diversity. It's everything that is unseen, invisible, and known and appreciated to us only through human contact and relationships. And these kinds of differences run across all cultures, and they also run across all individuals everywhere, no matter the culture. So let's take a look at some of these differences more in depth. So how are we all different? In cross-cultural studies, we have learned that there are pretty common differences across the world. So for example, looking at sense of self. Do we see ourselves as individuals or as part of a collective whose group needs outweigh our own needs? Does our primary identity center around work or around our family, community, or hobbies and passions? Communication. Do we communicate directly or indirectly? Are we emotionally restrained or emotionally expressive? What about body language, volume, how we handle interpersonal space? Motivation. Do we do things for our personal success or to serve a group or cause above and beyond us? What brings out the best in us? Competition or cooperation or both? Productivity. How do we get things done and define success? Is it by focusing on tasks and the product or through continuous process improvement? Our approach to productivity is related to how we deal with conflict. Time. In the United States, we're driven by schedules and what time it says on the clock. In other parts of the world, things take as long as they need to. Everything is fluid. Power and authority. Do we prefer flat egalitarian structures, or do we want hierarchy and levels of authority? Do we make decisions by voting, or by having leaders decide things for us? And finally, structure and ambiguity. Do we seek stability, control, and predictability, or do we enjoy taking risks, spontaneity, and not having things figured out? Now, the reason that these things are important is because they represent values that make up culture. And everywhere we work, there is a mainstream culture with policies, procedures, systems, and structures and rules that support the whole culture. In a moment, I want you to think about the values that govern your own organization. And I don't mean the stated values that are on a website or your promotional literature. Those are often at odds with what actually happens in daily working life. Instead, I want you to think about, on an everyday level, how do people treat each other and what are people's expectations about doing their work? Let's look at some values to guide us here. So here are some values to consider. And for the sake of time, just jot down the first 2 or 3 that stick out for you. What true values govern your organization? What pops out immediately? Take a few seconds, and we'd love to see a few responses come in to the chat box. So just take a few. And DJ, you'll be letting us know when anything comes in.
So please select some leading values that you work with. Take a moment. I know in my organization, the doing and taking action value, it's in contrast to being reflective and sometimes having the wisdom to know, doing nothing right now is, being still.
Right.
Would probably be wiser.
Yes, yes, yes. Do we have some shy people? That's okay, we can move on too.
Well, we'll have more questions.
Yeah.
So let's continue.
Okay. So in cross-cultural studies, we've identified some pretty common values that appear in mainstream American working culture. And I want to just run through a few of these patterns. And I want to remind everyone that not every person and not every organization will fit with these values, but they do appear as patterns. Do we have anything?
Yes.
Great.
So what Joe mentioned, cooperation and consciousness is prominent for him.
Oh, good.
And Lisa mentioned something not on the list, but respecting process.
Those are awesome.
Good value.
Oh,
It's
good.
prominent value for her.
Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. So moving on to some patterns in mainstream American working culture. So in the US, we tend to value verbal and direct communication as opposed to nonverbal and indirect communication, emotional restraint and objectivity instead of emotional expression and subjectivity, schedules and deadlines instead of a loose adherence to time, individualistic success as opposed to group or collective success, getting things done versus feeling and thinking things through before taking action, and facts and data versus people, patterns, relationships, all the immaterial elements of an organization.
When facts and data, we have a new response about data and action. So nice echo there.
Okay, okay. Now, if we go to the next slide, here is what's really fascinating. What % of the world do you think shares these values? Any guesses here? So I'd love to see more responses in the chat box.
So think of a number of what % of the world population subscribes and is aligned to this set of values.
Yes.
Feel free to start typing
Anything,
yeah.
wild guess. 25%, 40%, whatever it may be.
Still waiting, still waiting.
Do you have any guesses, DJ?
You know, 20 years ago, I would have said something like 70%.
Okay.
I really would have.
Okay.
We got some people typing in now. So 10%, 35%, 5%. Another response. There we go. Good. Less than 10%. Chris Cartwright, Aaron says 5%, Rian 15%.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a very smart audience.
Thank you for participating.
Yes. We have a very smart audience. So I heard a lot of pretty accurate guesses, and I heard the correct answer twice in these. So the actual percentage is actually, show you? Approximately 5%. So this figure comes from the total population of the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Northern Europe. So this means that a lot of people in the rest of the world prefer to communicate by body language or storytelling. They're pretty flexible with time, and they prefer to think and feel things through before making decisions, etc., etc. Amazing, isn't it? So that means that when we invite a global labor market to work for us in the US, and then we expect people to abide by these values 1, 2, 3, chances are we'll have some conflict there. But here's the thing. Within our own workforce in the United States, not all of these values sit comfortably with everyone. We have become too diverse for that. I want to take a look at some more values that are pretty common in the US. So we have this set of values, some pretty dominant Western values, and this is based on a very long cultural tradition in the West. Many of these were forged during the Industrial Revolution, and they became the values that comprise a kind of classic American business model. Up through the maybe late 20th century, all of this seemed to make sense. But do these make sense now? It turns out that we have emerging values that are different. And more research shows that these are the values expressed often by many, not all, but many women, people of color, immigrants, and dare I say, many white men too have these values these days. So we have these contrasts between the traditional and the emergent, and not much room for accommodating both as of yet in some workplaces. Now, I want to stress that there are no right or wrong values. There are no values that are better or worse than any other value. My point is simply this, that we have become accustomed to a prevailing value system, and we don't always recognize or understand what that value system really is. And so my argument is that one reason that we have such trouble promoting diversity is because we don't yet allow for diverse ways of doing work. In short, we don't let people be themselves at work. And when we can't be ourselves, we cannot influence organizational practices, much less strategies and systems. So what happens? Well, either we leave an organization and try to find a new one that fits in with who we are, or we stay and we conform to the prevailing value system, but that always comes at tremendous personal cost and sacrifice, and that contributes to things like groupthink or toxicity and strife and politicking and other organizational challenges. So what can we do? How can we enrich our workplaces and infuse more values into the way we do things at work? Which brings us to intercultural practices, and that is our next segment. Any questions up to this point?
No, but anytime you have a question or a comment that you want to share, feel free to type it in, and we'll work with it and address it.
Okay. So what is interculturalism? I want to first talk about interculturalism by starting off with some definitions, and just want to make sure we all understand what this means. So looking at definitions. Interculturalism: the mutual exchange of ideas and cultural norms and the development of deep relationships. The acknowledgement of similarities and differences between cultures and the ability to exchange, modify, and evolve culture. Taking place between cultures or derived from different cultures, and that's for the adjective intercultural from the OED. So we have these concepts and these words, mutual exchange, modifying culture, evolving culture, and deep relationships. And all of this suggests that we have dialogue and a continual shifting of our frame of reference. So if you and I come together and we're from radically different backgrounds, whatever that means, and we're now working together on a team at work, if we go about this the intercultural way, we are after not only mutual understanding and respect, but also a kind of creative cultural synthesis. So you and I bring things to the table, and out of what we both bring, we create a new way of doing things on our team. And my world is radically transformed because it's no longer about, well, this is how I do things, and this is how my people do things. I have now learned that there's more out there. So the world is now more complex and more mysterious, and there's a tremendous beauty in that complexity and mystery. If you've ever been abroad, if you've lived abroad or traveled extensively abroad, this should make sense. However, it also makes sense if you've ever had a colleague that you didn't understand at all, maybe you didn't like this person, there was no connection, and yet in spite of that, you created a constructive, productive, and meaningful working relationship. And it also makes sense to managers. A good manager is continually shifting frame of reference to meet different people's needs and different circumstances and situations, and still bringing out the best out of people and making the most out of a situation.
That's sometimes called a third culture approach.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Third culture approach. Now, does any of this come easily to us? Is this natural for human beings to do this? Nope, it is not very natural. This is intentional, and it's conscious and deliberate. The diversity author Robert Hales calls it working with the head, the hand, and the heart. And similarly, Milton and Janet Bennett, intercultural studies scholars, refer to mindset, skill set, and heart set. Let's take a look at these in more detail. So on the left side, looking at the head or mindset, the key things here are obtaining self-awareness of our own culture and knowledge about other cultures. This means that we realize, oh my gosh, I have a culture. This is what it is. And there are other cultures out there. They're different. When we look at the hand or skill set, this addresses our behavioral faculties. So the key skills here are empathy, listening, self-management of our emotions and reactions. When we look at the heart or heart set, we open up to the world and change our attitudes and beliefs with curiosity, tolerance of ambiguity, flexibility, and cultural humility, which means we're not arrogant in thinking our culture is the best. Now, it's important to note that all of these can be acquired. We can nurture these throughout our entire lives, and some come more easily to us than others. For myself, I know that empathy and listening are easier for me, but I have a very hard time managing my reactions, being tolerant of ambiguity, and being flexible. Looking at this, which ones are easier for you to practice? Which are not so easy? We don't need any responses in the chat box, but I just want you to pause for a moment and reflect on these, just for a moment. Now think of people at work. Who at work exemplifies any of these characteristics? And perhaps they are your allies in helping you lead diversity efforts. Moving on here to some foundational principles. So the intercultural way of being is learned, and it's a growth process. And there are certain principles that underlie this growth. Knowing these helps us move along through our journey. So the first principle, number one, culture is unconscious. It is learned so early in life that we don't have any memory of having learned anything. It's that deeply internalized. And this is true for all culture in life and in work. We're basically like fish in water. How does a fish become aware of water? Well, jump out of the fish bowl. We become aware as soon as we experience something different. Going abroad, working at a new organization, marrying someone from a totally different background, it changes everything for us. Number two, cultural self-awareness awakens us to other cultures. So when we've jumped out of the fishbowl and realized there's no water in here, it's dry, we have an aha moment. I have a culture, and this is what it is. With self-awareness, we see for the first time other ways of living and being. The more we understand about ourselves, the better we can explore these other ways of being and evolve our worldviews. 3, culture is a set of patterns rather than absolutes. There's a mainstream culture, but always variations within individuals. This helps us to avoid stereotyping because we know that not all people subscribe to the same values in the same way. 4, we experience culture shock. Now, we know that most of the time when we encounter something new, we don't like it. We experience resistance. We hate it. In other words, that's culture shock. And it doesn't just happen when we go to a new country. It happens every time we encounter that colleague that we don't understand, or a new rule or new process that we are now supposed to do at work and nobody asked us anything about it. We hate that. The intercultural studies scholar Stella Ting-Toomey defines culture shock as a violation of identity, the feeling that my identity has no protection, leading to rejection and confusion and disequilibrium. This is so important to remember when we embark on a diversity initiative and expect people to suddenly become enlightened and stop what they've been doing for years and years and now shift gears. It's not going to happen. And finally, number 5, becoming intercultural is a developmental process. Here we're looking at Milton Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. This is a very famous, very well-known model. And we see that there are 6 stages: denial, defense, minimization, and then a leap towards acceptance, adaptation, and integration. Now, I have a question for you. When you think of your own organization in terms of embracing diversity, where does it fall along this model? Does it reject diversity? Does it say, oh, we have no problem at all with diversity, we're fine? Or does it say, oh yeah, we've been working on this for years and years and it's a steadfast effort? So where does it fall? Just a few responses in the chat box would be great. Just one word. Denial, defense, minimization, acceptance, adaptation, or integration. Perhaps this is a deep question.
It is. And it's important to remember that these are just categories. It's Mitch Hammer once said something to the effect of, minimization isn't necessarily bad. And actually, in some instances, minimization is okay. People have won Nobel Peace Prizes for shifting a country to minimization. Okay, we've stopped killing each other.
Right.
So it's, relative and it's developmental.
Yes.
It takes time to grow there.
Yes.
So we're seeing some responses coming in. So reality is minimization. The claim is integration. We have one response.
Good distinction.
Is adaptation.
Oh, good.
Shauna says minimization. Let me get my scroll bar. There we go. In print, integration, but in reality, minimization.
Oh, okay.
So
it's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Glad to hear that you're making these distinctions. It's kind of like the stated values on our literature versus the actual values that we do every day.
Indeed.
So we have our aspirations and we have reality. And we need to have the aspirations. And also at the same time recognize where we truly are at today. Now the good news is that wherever an organization is or wherever any person is, you can address that person's needs or that organization's needs. There are specific developmental goals to address within each of these stages. So I'm just going to run through these quickly, and we'll pretend that I am your audience, and here's what you need to do to help me move along in my journey through this development. So looking at each of these stages in more detail, if I'm in denial, I might say things like, well, we all speak English here, we're fine, there's no problem. Then your goal is to introduce concepts of difference and what that means for the organization. I need you to talk about deep diversity and how having it leads to better thinking, seeing greater options, better problem solving, etc., etc. If I'm in defense, I could say, well, I've worked hard to get where I am, so don't tell me anything different. Don't make me feel guilty. In this stage, you want to stress similarities and encourage identification with others. I need your help in seeing our shared interests. Give me opportunities to work cross-functionally with others and to mingle and get to know people who are different from me within work and also beyond the work goals and the work setting. Minimization. We're all the same deep down. We're all human beings. The goal here is to achieve awareness of one's culture and humility about that culture. This is where you can facilitate the aha moments for me, like, oh, this is the culture here. I didn't realize. And continue giving me opportunities to work directly with people, as well as get to know them beyond the work tasks. Moving on to acceptance. Tell me more about your experiences. So help me recognize that people are complex without stereotyping. And here's where concepts of difference really solidify for me, but I have to be careful about making overgeneralizations. Adaptation. Let's get everyone in the room to talk about this. The goal here is to hone abilities for dialogue, exchange, and relationship building. At this point, I now see how we take certain things for granted, such as how we run meetings, how we expect people to talk to each other, what we look for in leaders and managers, and I want to make some changes to all that. Integration. We shape our culture by listening to everyone here. Here, empower people to normalize diverse ways of being. So for example, in meetings, I might now honor silence as much as I honor conversation. And I respect the need for reflection and deliberation while still valuing decisive action. So this is a lot to take in, but these developmental goals are a segue into our final segment about intercultural practices informing diversity work. Any questions here before we move on to our final segment?
There is a question, but
Yeah.
I'm going to save it toward
Okay.
the end. I think it's going to fit in better toward our conclusion.
Okay,
Yep.
good. All right, so home stretch. Looking at how can we use intercultural practices in diversity initiatives. This is important because many organizations are still in denial or defense, and our traditional methods of doing diversity have not been working. I'm going to show you a few numbers here. There is a longitudinal study published by the American Sociological Association, and they have concluded that in 829 diversity training programs reviewed over the course of 31 years, there have been no positive effects in the workplace where they have occurred.
That's surprising.
It's daunting.
Yes.
Yeah. We also have some numbers from the Center for American Progress. So 3.6% and 4.2%. So 3.6% is the Fortune 500 CEOs who are women, and 4.2% is the Fortune 500 CEOs who are people of color, male or female. So not good. Numbers are not very good. So what can we do about this? I suggest that first off we start with ourselves and we take these intercultural hallmarks and characteristics pretty seriously on our own, on the everyday level. So as a trainer, as a manager, a colleague, whatever your role may be, you have power. Whatever your title is, you can lead. Lead by being self-aware. Lead by being humble. Lead by being that flexible, open-minded, respectful person, even to the jerks at work. Be as empathetic and compassionate as you possibly can be. Listen to people deeply. Work in the gray zone. The world is not black and white. And be curious. Get to know people as people. What else? We can balance the head, the hand, and the heart in our actual diversity initiatives. What does this mean? Now, oftentimes in diversity work, we tend to focus exclusively on the head or the mindset. Sometimes we focus also on the behavior and the skill set. That's because it's easy to require people to draw upon knowledge and recite facts, and it's easy to require people to show a change in behavior. Now, whether that behavior is real or sincere, we don't know, but it's easy to focus on those first two because we can make people act a certain way or say certain things. We cannot, however, require people to change their hearts and their feelings and their attitudes. When we do hit people at the heart level, that is where the lasting and the enduring change lies. Now, going back to mindset, the head. So, teach knowledge by appealing to sound goals that warrant the need for diversity. What do we mean by that? Well, in other words, demonstrate good reasons for doing diversity work. Good reasons are things like, we've got to improve our employee retention. What can we do about that? Let's increase our employee satisfaction and happiness. Let's get better outcomes from our customers.
Let's drive more innovation.
Yes, let's drive more innovation.
And with diverse ideas.
Exactly. All of this will improve the bottom line. And why don't we create a great place to work while we're at it? Those are sound reasons. Reasons that are not sound are, oh my gosh, we're terrified of getting sued. we can't get into the litigation stuff. Or everybody else is doing it, well, I guess we should be doing it too. Or this is a fad. We need to jump on board and look good. Those are the worst reasons to embark on diversity initiative. So, sound reasons. Moving on to skill set. So, encourage new behaviors by integrating ongoing structural and systemic supports. So this means we have to build in behavioral change into people's daily work lives. Now in training, we talk about scaffolding, that we have to scaffold learning as we go. So taking this to heart, the scaffolding process. So we have a pyramid graphic here representing life at work. And the foundation of the pyramid of life at work is culture. Culture, the values and beliefs that shape our worldview. Culture is always upheld by systems and structures, such as reporting hierarchies, performance management, incentives, reward systems, etc. These structures drive certain behaviors and actions. What are they? What do we want to keep? What do we want to change? And then, above that, we have processes like communication protocols, workflow distribution, product development, or a supply chain. How can new approaches to work influence these? Above that, we have the team level. How do people interact in their teams, departments, and other work units? What is considered professional behavior? And finally, at the top, the individual, whose motivations, expectations, strengths, and needs we have to manage. All of these levels require attention and reform in a diversity program. So going back now to the heart set. Change attitudes and feelings by creating dialogue and a climate of tolerance and mutual respect. This is so often missing in organizations. We have forgotten that most of the time, most of us are doing the best that we can. And we have to assume that. We have to use that assumption as our starting point. So we assume that people do and say things with a good heart and the best intentions. Let's invite people to forums and conversations and get everybody to weigh in. And emphasize a learning exchange. Make space for all people to share feelings and to express what they think is going on. And this is in contrast to the way a lot of diversity programs have worked traditionally, because those programs are focused on compliance and force, which then brings out lecturing and talking at people. So compliance, as we saw in the numbers that we looked at a few minutes ago, compliance has only led to more inequity in addition to more toxicity in organizations. The other thing about compliance is that it tends to reinforce misguided notions that we're all the same, we're all people, people are people, and we have the same values and we have the same needs and the same expectations. We need the same things, which is not true. So compliance reinforces the existing status quo of a sort of monoculture. Now, I'd like to ask a question. There's one more thing we might consider doing, and it's a bit controversial, but it is something to think about. The thing to consider is this. Should we take diversity and inclusion out of diversity and inclusion? So in other words, should we reframe our work as some other kind of a learning initiative, such as communication styles or new ways to think about productivity or something else? Should we do that? I don't have an answer to this question, nor do I believe that there is any one right answer to the question. Some experts say that in organizations that are divisive, that are stuck in denial or defense, or that have a lot of psychological fatigue with diversity and inclusion, that this is an approach worth taking. This would be an opportunity to shift people's attention away from their fatigue and toxicity and more towards discussing the deeper diversity that we mentioned before. So it's an opportunity to reframe the issue entirely and start from scratch. Something to consider, especially if your workplace has had trouble and struggles with diversity before.
Janet Bennett sometimes refers to that as the slide.
The slide, yes.
Instead of the
Right.
mandate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. Yes, yes. Some parting words before we dive into Q&A. The burden, up to this point, the burden of success in our jobs and careers has been almost exclusively lying on the individual. So we tell people, here's what you need to do. Here's the system, and here's how to navigate the system. And here are your allies. Here's whom you're going to have to fight, and keep working harder and harder and harder. Except that the pathway is so narrow with our one value system. It's so narrow, and there's so many obstacles and ceilings and walls, so that only a fraction of people can get to where they want to be, if we don't fit in, that is to say. So my call to you is this: help make your organization self-aware of what it values and how it operates. Only then can we more sincerely and realistically remove some of these barriers and ceilings. Just as the consummate interculturalist appreciates all kinds of ways of being human, so too, a truly diverse organization understands that there are many ways to achieve its success. A truly diverse organization. A truly diverse organization values the employee who is slow and deliberate, as well as the one who is fast and efficient. Recognizes leadership in the quiet and humble, as well as in the strong and vocal. Allows people to individualize as well as standardize procedures. Considers intangible human mysteries while measuring data. And treats itself as an organic ecosystem rather than an algorithmic machine. And there we are. So thank you. Thank you for being here. And
we have time for some questions.
Yes, we do.
Let's cycle back to a question that was submitted earlier by Shannon.
Oh, okay.
And so Shannon writes, I'm resonating with this definition and approach of interculturalism, but I can imagine some feeling affronted by this, saying that race, for example, is the biggest issue, and to not put stronger emphasis on this is to increase systemic injustice. Any thoughts on how to navigate that?
Yeah, and that you're absolutely right in saying that some people might be affronted or might not really agree with this approach. I would say, however, that this can be integrated, maybe like nudging people towards this, because what you're referring to is a kind of anger and a very strong identification with injustice. And that's absolutely correct. Like, a person can and should feel these things if they have personally experienced this or it's been in their family history. However, operating from a sense of strong anger or a sense of injustice and retribution, and now I'm owed this, and you're the victimizer and you are the oppressor and you must make special accommodations for me, is not a way that is actually going to achieve societal results. Which is why, if we can balance that with these deeper forms of diversity to take the edge off and make the audience more receptive. So I know that every time I'm accused of doing something bad or saying something bad, and how dare you and how could you and you owe me an apology, that only makes me more defensive. It makes me angry, and I will retreat and I'll get into my box and my shell, and I don't want to engage this person. So we need to remove that kind of wall of the defensiveness, which this kind of anger only strengthens.
Let me add a follow-up question to that question. From an organizational perspective, in terms of being affronted, what about those dimensions of the organization may not be ready? So readiness,
Yes.
and how do you navigate
Yes.
and help get them ready?
Right, right, exactly. Readiness is so critically important, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. So if the organization is not ready, then start from the beginning. Start at the denial that there's any issue, that there's any problem, that there's nothing going on. Start from there and just start throwing in numbers and evidence that, well, we could be doing some things better. Let's explore how we might be doing some things better. Our turnover rate is really high. We've been doing what we're supposed to do. We're hiring people who look diverse, but they're leaving. What's going on? And start gently from that point of view. And once you see people starting to connect some dots on their own, that, okay, there is something going on here. There is something. Build from that.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Good. Well, thank you for all your participation. Thank you for all the wonderful questions throughout this. And I think this is great, useful information. I hope you're able to implement parts of it, some of it, a lot of it, and be inspired by it as you go forward in your work.
Yes, and do feel free to contact me and get in touch with me. I do this work as part of my consulting, and I do workshops, and I'd love to continue the conversation and take this further. So please don't hesitate to talk more with me about this.
Well, thank you, Demetra, and thank you, everybody. And we will see you guys next time. Thank you.
Thank you.